Welcome to the Saturday night class. My name is Bruce Director. I think you know me. We're joined tonight by Dan Leach, who, as you also probably know, because he's been a periodic guest on these classes. Dan is a longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche, um, uh, very skilled and effective fundraiser for LaRouche's presidential campaigns. He worked with LaRouche now for close to 50 years. But he's also a very skilled poet, publisher of 2 volumes of poetry and author of more poetry, which has yet to be published. And he is also quite a knowledgeable person on the subject of poetry and culture as LaRouche expressed it. Now, you may ask, why are we having a presentation and discussion on Saturday night about poetry at a time of such momentous change, both in the world and in the United States? And if you just look at the last week, it was quite an eventful week. You had the BRICS meeting in South Africa, which was attended by many other countries in addition to the 4 countries which were linked together by Goldman Sachs: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And some people have characterized this meeting as the coming together of a new coalition of the world's population, which will replace the United States in the G7 as the main economic power in the world and political power, and replace the dollar as a reserve currency. Tony Papert will be producing a article which will be up on the LaRouche PAC website soon that will disabuse you of that notion. Of course, some people see this from an anti-American perspective, that this is good, that all these countries are getting together, and the U.S. and the U.S. empire, as they like to call it, is going to get its comeuppance. And then some people see this as a alarm that these are the new enemies of the United States, and we have to be prepared to fight all these countries. Neither one is true, and it is both propaganda put out by the actual only real empire in the world today, which is the British Empire. And as LaRouche has identified, the British Empire is not the United Kingdom or the country of England, the United Kingdom, or the provinces of the United Kingdom, which exist in the island of Great Britain, but is a actual financial empire, which includes all kinds of forces, including Wall Street. And if you remember, the British East India Company really is an outgrowth, as LaRouche has pointed out, and Bob Ingram has written books on this, which you can get on Amazon, about, and Will Wirtz also has written a good book, which we promoted on the LaRouche PAC site, about this. But it grew out of Venice and became the Anglo-Dutch Empire, and started as various private entities like the British East India Company, the British West India Companies, the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch West India Company, and so forth. And these financial powers is really the only empire in the world. And none of these countries that are getting together around the BRICS are an enemy of the United States or a potential enemy of the United States. The only real enemy of the United States is the Anglo-Dutch British Empire, which currently has, unfortunately, a tremendous amount of influence in the American government. And in fact, has temporarily seemed to get a lot of control over it through the Biden administration. As Barbara Boyd outlined last week, the Biden administration is really the third Obama administration. But we'll go put that history aside for right now. But this was one major development which happened this week that was misunderstood by many people, and virtually everything, not just in the mainstream media, but also in the so-called alternative media that people like to pay a lot of attention to. Then you have the strange appearance in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which the Fox News called the GOP presidential debate, which I think demonstrated quite dramatically why Donald Trump is leading the Republican field and is undoubtedly the clear frontrunner for the Republican nomination, and why all these other candidates on that debate stage are completely either disqualified altogether because they really stand for everything that the Bush and Biden and Obama administrations have pushed, or they're just not quite ready for prime time. And that was contrasted by this very interesting discussion between Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson that was put up on Twitter at the same time, which I'm sure most of the people on this discussion have seen, since it was viewed by 231 or maybe now 250 million people. Of course, many of those must be outside the United States. So this is something that's being watched worldwide. It's not just an American electoral phenomena, and it far dwarfs the viewership of the sort of romper room display that Fox News put on to try and revive their collapsing ratings. And then, of course, the next day you had Trump having to appear at the Fulton County Jail to be arrested, fingerprinted, mugshotted, and booked on the ridiculous charges, now the fourth indictment of prepared against him by the through the Biden administration, but really by the Anglo-American Dutch Empire, making it very clear that he's the one they fear. And then you see also the other major thing that happened, I would say, in the visible domain of great significance, is the tremendous reaction against the indictment of Trump and the tremendous growing support that Trump has. Trump, I don't think in somewhat in jest, but he makes a point that, every indictment just leads to an increase in his support. You see the presentation of the effect of the Tucker Carlson Donald Trump interview, the reaction of the population to Trump, to the mugshot, which the Biden administration and the British Empire thought would humiliate Trump, and said it's become sort of a battle cry for Trump. And this sort of indicates what is really going on, which was not covered in the media anywhere except LaRouche PAC, and is expressed all over, which is the effect of an actual higher power. I would say an intervention of divine providence, which calls on us to do our part to continue and to carry out this fight to victory. This is, of course, not something you see, but you see the effect of it in terms of the way in which various people, including President Trump, ourselves, many of the people who are supporters, become instruments of this divine providence. And as many people have pointed out, this is not something new to American history. It is basically characteristic of the United States and our history. We came into existence as a result of a divine intervention, in my view. Washington was an instrument that fought against the British Empire and fought against popular opinion in the colonies, and later popular opinion in the Confederation that was established under the Articles of Confederation, and fought against the popular opinion once the Constitution was adopted to establish an actual functioning self-governing republic. Same thing occurred in the 1860s. 1850s and 60s, going back to the 1840s, as the country was being split apart by the issue of slavery, being pushed by the British Empire, and the emergence of Abraham Lincoln to challenge popular opinion and to become an instrument of divine providence to ensure that the British would be defeated and the United States would survive as a constitutional republic, which it not only did, but as a result of what Lincoln inspired, it became the most powerful economic engine in the world. It happened again, I would argue, under Franklin Roosevelt's leadership in the 1930s. And this is something that Lyndon LaRouche, as we mentioned in our email advertising this, has focused on. LaRouche actually focused on two important expressions of this concept. One was the essay by the poet, the 19th century British poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley, called In Defense of Poetry. Dan is quite knowledgeable about Shelley's poetry. He's spoken about that in these calls, and we're going to discuss that again tonight, in which Shelley made the famous statement that the poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And in a period of crisis like the one we're in now, the population becomes capable of receiving and imparting profound conceptions concerning man and nature. And I think we're seeing this all around us. The other expression that LaRouche referred to to express this is 1 Corinthians 13, the epistle of Paul to the Corinthians, which most of you are probably familiar with, in which I won't recite the whole thing, but Paul says, we see now as in a glass darkly, but then face to face, and that the things that are the most important are faith, hope, and love, and of these, the most important is love. And if you look at the interview between Tucker and Trump, you see that this would actually intervene there, because the two most important questions that Tucker asked Trump, one at the beginning was, they've done all these things to attack you and they haven't worked. What would keep them from killing you? And this is really the important point. Are you willing to give your life? And Trump has clearly demonstrated that. Everybody knows that if in January 2021, Trump would have gone back to Mar-a-Lago and said, I'm done with politics, I accept my defeat, I accept the election of Biden, I urge all my supporters to go home, and I'm out of politics, none of these attacks would have happened. But Trump also said at the time, and believed, that were he to do that, the country would go to hell and have no hope. And by standing up as hope and fighting, and as he said on his distribution of his own mugshot, never surrender, then this is an example of being willing to accept the bitter cup and give your life and everything for the sake of the truth. So that was another expression, in my view, of a divine sort of intervention, in which these men were being used as instruments of a higher power. And then at the end, where Tucker asked Trump, what about the question of civil war? And could the country fall into a civil war? And Trump said, I don't know, but this is a time of there's great love out there. There's also great hatred. And this is a very dangerous combination. So these are the most profound issues which are being discussed in politics. It's not abortion. It's not the war on Ukraine. It's not the federal budget deficit. It's not whether or not we abolish the Department of Education, or whether or not we order same-sex bathrooms in schools, or any of these things that people appear to be passionate about. They're these profound questions concerning man and nature. Now, some of you may wonder what's the connection and why LaRouche would cite the writings of a 19th century poet who was a professed atheist, a student of the Enlightenment, and the essential writer of the Christian faith as expressing the same principle, the same idea, because these go against the constant efforts to try and put people into pigeonholes and categories and names. And you see that this higher principle, this higher power acts regardless of labels, regardless of Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, left, right, religious, non-religious, whatever label you think you might be or act within, you too can be made an instrument of this higher power. And when given that opportunity, one must take it in order to make sure to achieve the good. So this is what we want to discuss tonight. And we're very happy to have Dan joining us because he really is an expert in thinking about this. He's done a lot of studying and he's knows quite a bit about it. And I want to turn it over to him right now to give us a little bit of a exposition of his thoughts on the matter.
Thanks, Bruce. You covered a lot there, and there's a lot of potential takeoff points, but I thought it would be useful to give our audience a little bit of an insight into the way that LaRouche thought about the process we're living through right now, which and why he was so taken with the way that Shelley thought about this. And I'll actually give you a little bit of a little snippet of some of Shelley's writing and a bit of one of his famous poems to illustrate this. But I want to go back a little bit and just resituate why Bruce and I and others thought it would be important to have a discussion like the one we're having tonight, because it's very clear when you saw that interview that Tucker Carlson did with President Trump. Trump almost seems amazed at the spirit, as he himself said, of the movement that is out there supporting him. It's astonishing, really. I mean, this is millions and millions of Americans who have this spirit of solidarity with one another, of love, not just for Trump, but for the country, for the past generations that gave us what we have, for future generations, and that it seems to motivate them to do extraordinary things. Turn out in he thinks there were maybe 1 million people there on January 6th, and then he also identified this principle of love, that this is what he takes from it more than anything else, and that they take from him, and that sort of prompted us to revisit something that Lyndon LaRouche used to talk about, really from the time Bruce and I first knew him in the late 60s and into the 70s, which was which he called the mass strike. Now, the first person who identified this process was Shelley. LaRouche came to it a little bit later on in the form that it was put forward by Rosa Luxemburg, who was ironically a communist theoretical thinker in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But the phenomenon is nonetheless a valid one. It's a period in history of great crisis, where all of the existing institutions come into question, the existing authorities come into question, the perception by the majority of people that they have been victimized, and uh, uh, and and also that they in working together, right, don't have to be victims anymore. When they become empowered by a sense of potent action in the world, but even more than that, when they begin to actually respond as if it were as a mass, not even necessarily communicating with each other, but all the same, thinking and feeling the same sort of things at once, as if there were the way that a magnetic field organizes, the metal filings that you used to experiment with in school. All the individual things are responding to something greater. Now, this can be discussed, how the things that come that sort of feed into it, the culture of the country, the language culture, the music, the influences they had in their families, their education, etc. But there's still something about this kind of process, a mass strike phenomenon that seems to be greater than all of those things added up, and in this case, greater than even President Trump, even though he's the person who, you might say, enabled it or provoked it. Even he is astonished by the spirit of this thing. Now, the reason why, I'll just give you a little bit of background into what first interested LaRouche in this, and let me point out that neither Shelley, who lived from 1795 until 1822, or Lyndon LaRouche, who lived from 1922 until 2019, neither of them actually ever witnessed the mass strike in action. I mean, LaRouche did witness a rebellion by the Indian people when he was a serviceman in World War II. But the kind of thing we're talking about here is much greater than simply a rebellion. But both of them being, that is Shelley and LaRouche, being keen observers and really scientists of the human mind and emotions and everything that goes into what makes people, what makes them what they are. Both of them had, you might say, a faith that under the right kind of conditions, this is what could happen that could bring about the kind of change necessary to transform society. And Shelley lived at a time when the corruption of his government in England was very similar. In fact, if I read to you the entirety of his poem, The Mask of Anarchy, you would see so many parallels to what is happening today. The corruption of government, the never-ending wars. None of this is new. This is the way that the oligarchy has always functioned, to enslave people mentally, spiritually, and physically. And Shelley wrote his defensive poetry in order to make the point that it was only by acting on the interior of people, you may say, their heart and their soul, their emotions, and what motivates them spiritually, that you could ever bring about the kind of transformation in society that would bring about something good. Because it's the enemy, it's the oligarchs who control the lower emotions. If you want to put it in religious terms, that's Satan's realm. Fear, lust, greed, all of rage, anger. These are all the lower emotions. But this higher emotion of love, and in here we're talking about the highest expression of it, which the Greeks called agape, the highest form of love. There's philos, there's eros, which is where erotic comes from. Philos is friendship, Philadelphia, and then there's agape, the love of the Creator and of mankind, and for your fellow man, for the sake of because they have the image of the Creator in them as you do. And so Shelley understood this, even though, as Bruce pointed out, he professed himself to be an atheist, because if you knew anything about the Church of England at the time he was writing, you could understand why he wanted to reject what was called Christianity at the time. It was fake, as much of religion is in America in recent years. It professed things, but went along with a system of corruption. But Shelley, he wrote his defensive poetry in response to another writer in his time that wrote a work called I think it was Thomas Love Peacock was his name, who wrote something called The Four Ages of Poetry, in which his overall argument was, poetry's fine. And, you'll recognize this line of thinking, I'm sure. It makes you feel good. It's nice to have, beautiful thoughts and everything. But ultimately, practical knowledge, the mechanical arts, science, material science, economics, the things that allow you to make money, have success in the world, are much more useful. This is what's of course called the utilitarian argument. And Shelley, when he read this essay, "The Four Ages of Poetry," became indignant that this was provably untrue and a dangerous kind of thinking. And he wrote his defensive poetry, which there's not time tonight to explore it in any depth. I'll read an excerpt from it so it'll give you a little bit of an idea. For exactly the same reason, I believe, that Lyndon LaRouche devoted his whole life to the science of economics, which for LaRouche was not about money or wealth or any of the things that you think of with economics. It was the science of how the creative capacity that only the human mind has. Right, we are the only creatures who can actually create new ideas, and through proving the truth of ideas through experimental science, and then being able to design new machines and new technologies based on those principles that with the mind have greater power over the physical world around us, create wealth, that is greater than what's there. Wealth doesn't come from the ground. It doesn't come from minerals or agriculture. It comes from the creativity of the human mind. And LaRouche understood that and devoted his life to the science of how that elaborated that science. Shelley, in a similar manner, understood that the source of all human achievement throughout history, and his defensive poetry is a masterclass in a scientific outlook of all of human history. He starts with Homer and goes right up until his time and shows the way in which poetry, broadly defined, not just poetry written in verse form, but he calls it the spark of the divine. This creative spark that only mankind has can be seen in the oratory of great orators. Think of Lincoln, for example, probably the best example we have in the English language of someone whose very words were alive with poetry, with metaphor, and with rich in ideas that moved people's souls to do great and noble things. Or think of Martin Luther King. Think of his mountaintop speech, or really any of them. Or as Shelley said, poetry can be sometimes just one sentence, or it can be the essence of something of the way that great architecture affects us. In other words, it touches something divine in man that makes him aware of his immortality, the immortality of his soul, and our own fundamental identity as creatures that are greater than our physical selves, that we have an immortal soul and that we have this infinite capability. Whenever that appears, whether it's in music or the written word, right, or in visual art, Bruce has a prime example of poetic metaphor, behind him, the famous painting "The School of Athens" by Raffaello. But whenever this appears, this has whenever it is appears, it has been accompanied. It accompanies and has been accompanied by great works in political institution, revolutions, renaissances, periods of great flowering of creativity, and also greater freedom, because you have to allow freedom of thought to be able to encourage creativity. This is what's so dangerous about the times we're living in right now. They're trying to wipe out, the masters of the internet, the Silicon Valley and their alliance with, with the intelligence agencies and the cancel culture, and and the thought police and everything that everybody on this class is well aware of. But they're trying to destroy the very essence of what makes us human, which is this capacity for creativity. So I think so LaRouche was very drawn to this work by Shelley. I guess I'll go ahead and I'll read an excerpt from it right now, just to give you a flavor of it. This is from A Defense of Poetry by Percy Bysshe Shelley. Poetry is indeed something divine. It is at once the center and the circumference of knowledge. It is that which comprehends all science and that to which all science must be referred. It is at the same time the root and blossom of all other systems of thought. It is that from which all spring, and that from which adorns all, and that which, if blighted, denies the fruit and the seed, and withholds from the barren world the nourishment and the succession of the scions of the tree of life. It is the perfect and consummate surface and bloom of all things. It is as the odor and the color of the rose to the texture of the elements which compose it, as the form and splendor of unfaded beauty to the secrets of anatomy and corruption. What were virtue, love, patriotism, friendship? What were the scenery of this beautiful habit? What were all our consolations on this side of the grave? And what were our aspirations beyond it, if poetry did not ascend to bring light and fire from those eternal regions where the owl-winged faculty of calculation dare not ever soar? Poetry is not like reasoning, a power to be exerted according to the determination of the will. A man cannot say, I will compose poetry. The greatest poet even cannot say it, for the mind in creation is as a fading coal, which some influence, like an inconstant wind, awakens to transitory brightness. This power arises from within, like the color of a flower which fades and changes as it is developed. And the conscious portions of our natures are unprophetic either of its approach or its departure. Could this influence be durable in its original purity and force, it is impossible to predict the greatness of the results. But when composition begins, inspiration is already on the decline. And the most glorious poetry that has ever been communicated to the world is probably a feeble shadow of the original conceptions of the poet. You get an idea of the beauty of his thinking and the way in which he thought about this. I'm not screen. Oh, I know I wasn't screen sharing. I'm sorry. So getting back to what this means for the situation we have right now. Shelley goes on not only to show the influence of poets and poetry in inspiring and amplifying and spreading, you might say, these great creative moments in human history. The Italian Renaissance being one of the greatest. I mean, everything we have in modern civilization, including the first ideas of a republic, emerged out of Plato and then the Italian Renaissance. And as LaRouche pointed out, the people that came to these shores and founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony were the entire project of colonizing the New World was done in order to create a space in which human freedom, intellectual, religious, intellectual freedom could exist and flourish in a form of society which was not run by these evil oligarchs, came out of the Italian Renaissance, which itself was a revival of the ancient Athenian democracy. So after going through this discussion, Shelley says that he has great faith. I'm kind of condensing and paraphrasing the way he puts this, that such a moment will happen again soon, that people will rise up and take their natural rights that have been so oppressed in the England of his time, and that this spirit of this creative spirit is what will animate it. And even though he himself, I think the parallels are rather interesting, even though he himself, as Bruce has pointed out about, Trump being persecuted, but, in this case, this was somebody who was literally hounded out of his country, almost killed, and eventually was probably murdered by agents of the British Crown. Basically gave up everything, his country, the friends he had, everything in pursuit of this sacred idea that he had about what mankind was capable of. And in the case of LaRouche, persecuted, sent to prison, consigned to, I mean, even though we had a following in the hundreds of thousands throughout the 1980s and 90s, more in the 80s than later on, LaRouche never tapped into the kind of thing that we're seeing right now that Trump has, even though he laid the groundwork for it. So in the case of both Shelley and LaRouche, it was a tremendous faith in humanity, in what human beings are capable of, that they all ultimately have this spiritual capability of responding to a higher power that could eventually, that if the conditions were right, this idea would spread and bring about a beautiful change, a change for the good. So I think what I'll do, I don't know, you think it's appropriate to read this at this
Sure.
point?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm
I'm gonna, I'm gonna read. You'll recognize the very last stanza of this because it's in the invitation to our meeting tonight. This is from a famous poem that Shelley wrote. It's called "The Mask of Anarchy." Mask, like a play, Masque. The Mask of Anarchy. Now, he wrote this in response to a real atrocity that was committed by the British government while he was in Italy. But when he found out about this, he immediately picked up his pen and wrote this. It's called the Peterloo Massacre, where there was a large demonstration of workers near Manchester. I forget exactly what the issue was, whether they were being oppressed in some. I mean, the working class in England at the time, it was horrible. I mean, child labor, people being forced to work long hours for almost nothing. They, were starving, and they protested. Some 50,000 of them in a field near Manchester, and the British government sent the troops in on horseback and swords flashing, and just started slashing them to pieces and killed. I mean, no one knows exactly how many people were killed, but it was a horrible massacre. And these were men, women, even children. And Shelley was incensed by this. And he wrote The Mask of Anarchy. The whole first, I mean, this is many stanzas long. The whole first part of it just describes in excruciating detail, you might say, the criminal nature of the oligarchical mind. And he names all the king and the ministers and everybody else involved in the process of doing it. It reminds me a little bit of Dante, putting all of the leading bad guys in Italy at the time in hell, in his Inferno, in the Divine Comedy. Shelley denounces the entire political establishment of his day, and basically shows that they're all animated by a spirit of evil, right? And it's very bloody, and it's very, but it's very precise. And then at a certain point in his poem, what happens is the personification of hope, which is a young woman in rags, steps in front of the horses that are coming in to claim their final victory. Murder, fraud, tyranny, these various things that have been personified that are agents of evil. They're riding in to finally take over the parliament, the halls of power, and completely destroy forever the freedom of the English people. And Hope, this young woman, Hope personifies, steps in front of the horses, prepared to give her life. So again, think of this of this characteristic that Bruce alluded to, that Trump is doing, that Lyndon LaRouche did. Lyndon LaRouche had every reason to believe he'd be killed in prison. He was offered a deal whereby he could have avoided prison and could have fled the country, as was Socrates offered that choice, but decided, no, if I give in to this, or if I violate truth and the law, then what has my life been about? It's better to give one's life and uphold the higher principle than it is to live a few years longer and compromise your principles. So this is, I think, very much the idea that Shelley has in mind. Hope steps in front of the horses and lays down. And here's where I'll just read this section up until a certain point. Then she lay down in the street, right before the horses' feet, expecting, with a patient eye, murder, fraud, and anarchy. When between her and her foes a mist, a light, an image rose, small at first and weak and frail, like the vapor of a veil. Till as clouds grow on the blast, like tower-crowned giants striding fast, and glare with lightnings as they fly, and speak in thunder to the sky, it grew, a shape arrayed in mail, brighter than the viper's scale, and upborne on wings whose grain was as the light of sunny rain. On its helm, seen far away, a planet like the morning's lay. And those plumes its light rained through like a shower of crimson dew. With a step as soft as wind it passed, o'er the heads of men, so fast that they knew the presence there, and looked, but all was empty air. As flowers beneath May's footstep waken, as stars from night's loose hair are shaken, as waves arise when loud winds call, thoughts sprung where that step did fall. And the prostrate multitude looked, and ankle deep in blood, Hope, that maiden most serene, was walking with a quiet mien. And anarchy, that the ghastly birth lay dead, earth upon the earth. The horse of death, tameless as wind, fled, with all his hoofs did grind to dust the murderers thronged behind. A rushing light of clouds and splendor, a sense awakening, and yet tender, was heard and felt. And at its close the words of joy and fear arose, as if their own indignant earth, which gave the sons of England birth, had felt their blood upon her brow, and shuddering with a mother's throe, had turned every drop of blood by which her face had been bedewed to an accent unwithstood, as if her heart had cried aloud, men of England, heirs of glory, heroes of one story, nurslings of one mighty mother, hopes of her and one another, rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. It goes on, but you get a sense of it. Something comes over the crowd, and suddenly they're inspired by this higher power, and the enemy flees. So maybe what I'll do is close with one more snippet here. I'm not going to try to do it on my computer. I'll mess something up. I'm sure I'll just read it. Remember these? They're called books. This is the end. This is towards the of a defense of poetry. This is the sentence which Lyndon LaRouche, Mr. LaRouche, would often cite, which speaks to the faith that he and Shelley had in this mass strike process emerging at some point. And after Shelley, I mean, this is a fairly long work, 20 or so pages, as I said, surveying the history of humanity and showing the intervention of this divine quality, often not even, well, as you'll see, this is towards the end when he expresses his faith that this will emerge. He says, "The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. The persons in whom this power resides may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little apparent correspondence with the spirit of good of which they are the ministers. But even while they deny and abjure, they are yet compelled to serve the power which is seated upon the throne of their own soul." So that, as I said, was often cited by Mr. LaRouche because it's faith in this divine potential within all human beings that can be inspired by great ideas and call up in them, from, you might say, even their long dead, or long sleeping memories. I mean, you see people today talking about how they were inspired by a story about George Washington when they were in the second grade, and all of a sudden they get involved in this political movement that we're all part of, and it makes them go back and revisit something from years ago and give it new life. Or it could be something that they learned in church, that never seemed real to them before, but all of a sudden it is. Bruce talked about St. Paul and 1 Corinthians 13. This embodies the principle we're talking about here. But whatever the elements that feed into this mass strike process, which seems to be like the mist, in Shelley's poem that descends, on people and is moving them, yet they can't see it. Whatever the elements that go into it, it's something greater than any of those elements or any of the people involved. It really is something divine. Now, Bruce, if you'd like to, we can. That's kind of what I have. We can discuss the implications of this in terms of the way Lynn thought about the phase spaces that make up the universe. Because Lynn,
I want to thank you a lot, Dan, for that discussion. I think it really did address things which, if they weren't on our audience's mind before you discussed them, they should be now.